Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is under scrutiny and is being accused of censorship for passing a law that would grant his government the okay to block news websites. Ukraine's parliament passed the legislation in the final days of 2022.
Under the new law, Ukraine's State Broadcasting Council would have greater power, allowing it to regulate television, print, and online media, and even social media networks like YouTube. According to the Kiev Independent, this is not the first time Zelensky has moved to exert more control over the media there. A 2019 law gave the Media Council power to issue media licenses or to revoke them. The new law expands the scope of existing legislation and was allegedly implemented to combat Russian propaganda as the war in Ukraine rages on. So this is not the first time we've discussed this. Zelensky violating basic civil liberties and free speech protections in a manner that should concern everyone, especially should concern his vociferous supporters in the Western world and in Western media. And among Democratic and many Republican politicians as well. Look, we're saying there are moral stakes to this conflict, and I agree that there are moral stakes, that Russia is an autocratic country with a very corrupt and authoritarian government that has launched this unconscionable war, but the more Zelensky does things like this, the more the Ukrainian government comes to resemble the very sort of autocracy we're ostensibly trying to prevent.
Yeah, this is the thing. If the line is simply, you can't invade another country's borders, Russia started an illegal war, therefore we have to defend Ukraine, nothing here changes that. Mm-hmm. But we all know that the argument has been expanded well beyond that. And it's about regime change in Russia. It's about advancing democracy. And in promoting that rhetorical project, Democrats and, establishment Republicans have really held up Ukraine as this kind of bastion of Western ideology in the eastern part of Europe in a way that completely does not gel with the reality on the ground. And when you look back to reporting on Ukraine before this particular conflict, you got a lot more of a clear-eyed description of the corruption in the country, of the influence of Nazism in the country. A lot of people were just talking about the celebration of Bandera, who's a kind of a national figure of sorts over the past week, who was I don't know how else to say it, who, was a Nazi, sympathetic Nazi figure. So, all of these things can exist in a country. Obviously, there's a diversity of politics and interests and beliefs in the United States of America, and the same is true everywhere else. And saying that doesn't mean anything about whether or not you should have an interest in defending what Russia's doing or that Russia is a good guy at any of this or anything like that. But it is frustrating that there still seems to be this very heavy-handed, jingoistic portrait of Ukraine being painted that justifies doing more than just defending Ukraine. It justifies this regime change operation.
And Zelensky is one of the most celebrated figures of modern times right now. He's being hailed as like a modern George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, although, of course, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and imposed a draft, right? So never meet your heroes. And that speaks to how wartime, the first death in the first casualty in war, what they say is the truth, but it's also civil liberties and free speech and all sorts of other things. So that's not necessarily surprising. I think it's still something to lament, and really, confuses a little bit what's even not what they're fighting for, but what we're doing in our support of them. From a distance, or the moral case.
I think the folks over at Useful Idiots podcast had a bit where they supercut all of the times Zelensky had been referred to as a Churchill-like figure over the course of his visit to Congress over the past week. We all were treated to the images of him.
I guess that's not a compliment coming from that source.
Right, no, but they're pointing out how like weirdly aggrandizing the coverage has been. Randomly pulling random historical figures from the ether and analogizing them to Zelensky in a way that probably isn't warranted, doesn't really make a lot of sense, is intended to fluff him up, as it were, and how ridiculous that kind of propaganda has been. And we saw him with the flag draped over the dais in Congress, and it's not that any one aspect of it is a problem per se, but taken in total, it betrays, I think, a failure to critically look at what our role is in the conflict. Because if you think it is nothing but this moral crusade, then anything will justify it. A blank check makes sense. And framing it as a kind of a World War II posture, which many of us have been brought up to believe was the critical existential war, the war in which America was most faultless and on the right side of things, despite there being some historical complications about why and when we got into it and what took us so long, it's framing it in those terms very clearly is a propagandistic effort to justify whatever the deep state wants to do in the situation. I think that's very dangerous. Yeah,
and speaking of that, we should keep in mind as we condemn what Zelensky is doing here is closing, stifling dissent and preventing Russian sources from speaking. That is something where we don't now have a lot of ground to stand on, as we're seeing in these Twitter files, the constant efforts by government actors, by law enforcement, and by political figures to pressure social media companies, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and others, to restrict content sourced to Russia, imputing that it was nefarious or all part of efforts by the Russian government, even when these own social media sites were looking and saying, no, that's not what that is.
Right, exactly.
So it shows you how slippery this stuff can be, even in a country that has a very robust First Amendment to really offer incredible protection of dissenting speech. But we should really got to look at whether we're coming close to violating that or have, and in fact are well over the line.
Yeah, and look, even if you disagree with the content that's run by a program like RT, which is one of the sites that got taken down in the course of this Twitter files covered purge. It is important to understand what people who do not share your ideological beliefs, people, even if you think it's propaganda, whatever it is, it's important to know what they're saying because you have to be able to combat alternative narratives. When you shut down any and all dissent, you do get yourself into a place where people are in a North Korea-ish posture, where they don't even have the tools to understand how the rest of the world sees them and what's going on. And I would hope that we're not so fragile or so vulnerable as a community that we think one website in RT is an existential threat to America, given the huge corporate media apparatus and the, frankly, propaganda that comes out of all of these media institutions. We all have our biases.
Well, that does it for right now, but later today, former Michigan Representative Justin Amash will join us in studio to discuss the results of the speaker vote so far. We don't know right now if we'll have a speaker or not, and then that will post very shortly after the vote's being taken. Tomorrow, I will be out. I've got a jury duty summons I could not get out of this time, but you're in good hands because Batya Ungar-Sargon will be here with Brianna.
All right, well, we'll miss you, Robbie. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts, and you can catch us on Roku and other streaming services.
See you later.
Bye-bye.